The most common definition I've encountered for Metroidvania is a subgenre of video games focused on guided nonlinearity and utility-gated exploration. I especially like this definition because it builds up from what I consider to be the least important aspects to the most important aspects. The first part is a bit generic, but sets us up for the rest of the definition. Sure, we could get into the weeds and hash out the differences between a genre and a subgenre, or what do we really mean by focus if we wanted to, but I don't think that would make for a very compelling or informative discussion, at least not at this stage. If we continue, we move on to the word guided, which is an important piece, but not as important as what follows: nonlinearity. The word guided lets us know that there is an intended path and kicks out the pretense of an open-world sandbox. But the specification of nonlinearity helps us hone in on the fact that the intended path is not the only viable one, which does wonders for helping us visualize the sort of experience we should expect. To close it out, the phrase utility-gated exploration is, in my opinion, the key to the definition and could arguably stand on its own. Utility-gated exploration is quite a dense phrase, so let's unpack it a bit. To do so, moving forward, I'll look to introduce some vocabulary in the attempt to make the discussion of this complex topic a bit more efficient and hopefully easier to understand. The guided, non-linear exploration of Metroidvanias is made possible via a system of locks and keys that I'll refer to as utility gates and utility upgrades respectively. In other words, think of the utility gates as locked doors, impassable until you find and use the correct utility upgrade to unlock them and progress through. They function similarly to regular locks and keys in games. Have you ever played a game where you encountered a red door that you couldn't get past, so you explored in a different direction and found a red key, which sparked a light bulb over your head that led you to bring that red key back to that red door where you were able to unlock it and see what was beyond it? Imagine with me now if that red key became a permanent part of your inventory and also allowed you to do at least one other action besides opening red doors. That's what a utility upgrade is. I will admit that this is a bit reductive, but also, let's be real, that's exactly what a utility upgrade is. Whether it's a double jump that allows you to get to new areas that have a higher ledge and also makes dodging enemy attacks easier, or a hook shot that allows you to access areas that have a hook-shottable post you can zip over to, while also giving you the ability to stun enemies with it in combat, or even just a red key that opens red doors, but can also be thrown at enemies to do damage. It's a utility upgrade in my book. To further break down the term utility upgrade, we can likely agree that the general definition of utility being used here is that something has more than one function. In regards to the definition of upgrade, we may need to rely more on game design context and nomenclature. I do want to remind everyone that the word upgrade is of my own choosing and not part of the specific definition I cited at the beginning of the video. To be clear, the Metroidvania genre has a remarkable amount of what I'd like to call potential jargon that, while quite important to the discussion of the genre, doesn't have an agreed upon definition. So I'll continue to state and define some specific terms as we go. That being said, I would consider an upgrade to be something that has some permanence rather than being temporary, like a power-up. When you think of Samus getting the Ice Beam in Metroid 2, that feels like an upgrade due to its permanence. You're going to have access and make use of this ability for the rest of the game. This is especially apparent when you compare it to Kirby swallowing a drifter enemy and being able to attack with its umbrella power in Kirby's Dream Land 2. The umbrella attack does have utility since it allows you to attack in a novel way, as well as get past blocks that are weak to nothing but umbrellas, but I would argue that the umbrella attack is less of an upgrade and more of a power-up due to its functionality being temporary. Permanence is an important distinction because over the course of a playthrough of a Metroidvania game, you'll likely collect multiple utility upgrades. How these utility upgrades interact with each other can range from having little to no effect, complementing, or even cannibalizing each other. An example of cannibalization would be how in Super Metroid, once you gain access to the space jump and can infinitely hover around, the movement utility of the grapple beam is no longer needed. In this case, the space jump has cannibalized the utility of the grapple beam upgrade. An example of complementary utility upgrades would be how in Hollow Knight, the dash plus the double jump allow you to string movement combos together. In this case, both utility upgrades complement each other. Hey, quick editor's note here. I wouldn't consider dependent utility upgrades to be complementary. I would define dependent utility upgrades as upgrades that wouldn't function at all unless you had previously obtained the upgrade they're improving. For example, in Hollow Knight, the Shade Cloak requires you to have dash for it to function at all. The ice missiles in Metroid Fusion are also an example of a dependent utility upgrade. They can be complementary to other utility upgrades, but the relationship between regular missile utility upgrade and the ice missile utility upgrade is not a complementary one, but a dependent one. And the other thing is, I'm not 100% sure that's how you pronounce complementary. I'm kind of scared that I've said it too many times at this point, so I'm just gonna get out of here. Good luck, other Plexicraft. I will do what I can to assist. While cannibalization isn't the end of the world, and there are exceptions to the rule, I would argue that complementary utility upgrades tend to be better designed due to the variety of gameplay they add, as well as the types of gates that are able to be used to foster guided nonlinear exploration. As a game designer, if you think of a scenario where you'd like the player to have both the dash upgrade as well as the double jump upgrade to progress, one way to do so would be to put one gate after the other and require them to dash through a tight space and then double jump up a ledge to access that new area. But that wouldn't teach the player that the upgrades are complementary. Instead, a quick and dirty alternative solution would be to create a pit that is so large that it requires the player to use both upgrades in combination to cross it. This could potentially allow the player to find both upgrades in different orders prior to reaching this complementary gate, which would support the non-linear element of the genre. The complementary gate itself supports the guided element, especially when used as a sort of bottleneck to ensure that the player has sufficient upgrades required to adequately explore and ultimately progress in the new area. Now that we talked through some examples of guided non-linearity, this might be a good point to at least mention sequence breaking, or the act of obtaining items, power-ups, or upgrades out of the intended or guided order. This is typically used for speedrunning a game, aka completing it as fast as possible, and other sorts of challenge runs. But some people, myself included, just enjoy the fact that sequence breaking allows players to add some variety and agency to a playthrough. The concept of sequence breaking isn't unique to Metroidvanias. For example, I don't think anyone would consider a game like Monster Hunter World to be a Metroidvania, but you can still sequence break and hunt the monster Anjanath early to get his relatively powerful armor and set pieces by finding him out in the wild early in the game, rather than waiting until the mission to hunt him comes up. However, I'd argue the genre where the impact of sequence breaking is most significant is the Metroidvania genre. It's where the aspect of guided nonlinearity really shines. There are a few ways to dichotomize. Real quick, editor Plexicraft here again. Let me just back this up for a second. I just want all of you to know how neat it was to think through this script, get a random shower thought of a sentence where I used the word dichotomize because it felt like the right type of word I wanted to use, but had no idea if that word actually existed, yet still banked it in my mind anyway, and eventually typed it out into a Word doc only to find that no red squiggly line appeared underneath it. Sure, I could have used the more common bifurcate, but dichotomize has much better connotations for what I'm trying to describe. That, and now I have a real published video with evidence of me using the word dichotomized correctly. That's pretty rad. Let me just pop you all back in here to let that line really land. There are a few ways to dichotomize methods of sequence breaking. Glitches versus developer intended or legal breaks, trial and error versus tutorialized knowledge keys, mechanical execution versus pure knowledge upgrades. As expected, each example can fit into other examples in dichotomies. For one of them, pogoing on spikes in Hollow Knight would be a trial and error, developer-intended, mechanical execution method of sequence breaking because it's not outright taught to the player and must be discovered via experimentation or trial and error. It is required to progress through an optional area, so we have clear evidence the developers intended for it to be used, and it requires precise mechanical input to be used as opposed to simply using an ability in a previously unknown way. Sometimes mixing these dichotomies is a bit redundant, since a tutorialized knowledge upgrade is obviously developer intended. And these are not the only ways to dichotomize sequence breaking methods. But if I were to go any deeper into this, we would be here all day. Please leave some that I missed in the comments, and we can get into a more in-depth discussion there. Speaking of knowledge upgrades and knowledge gates, it's worth popping out of the sequence breaking rabbit hole and discussing, well, another rabbit hole. The rapid growth of a genre many, myself included, are calling Metroidbraiниas. Yeah, there are dozens of us. Where Metroidvanias have a lock and key system of utility gates and utility upgrades, Metroidbrainias have a lock and key system of knowledge gates and knowledge upgrades. Similarly to how a Metroidvania might show a tall ledge to you before giving you the ability to jump high enough to access it via a utility upgrade, Metroidbrainias will often show you a puzzle that you don't even know is a puzzle until you're given the answer to it later on. How might they differ from point-and-click adventures, you might ask? Well, maybe you might not, but I did. The best answer I got was from a user on Reddit named Ironfire TV, who explained, and I'm paraphrasing in my own words, many point-and-click adventure games have knowledge upgrades that are used once and then not needed for any other knowledge gate in the game. Metroidbrainias typically include knowledge upgrades that are much more reusable, thus impactful, so much to the degree that once discovered, you can often start a new playthrough and rush to the end of the game almost immediately, just because you now know the secret or secrets to getting there. End of paraphrase. Games you might have heard of in this genre include everything from The Outer Wilds to Tunic to Tokitori 2 to The Witness. Some focus solely on knowledge-based progression like The Witness, The Outer Wilds, and Tokitori 2. These games lean further into the puzzle or point-and-click adventure genres, while others include knowledge gates as well as utility gates, like La Milana, Tunic, and Animal Well, which makes them easier to envision as an evolution of Metroidvanias. The largest difference between the two types is that the latter tends to have more replayability due to the gameplay loop diversifying its types of locks and keys, and not committing solely to knowledge upgrades that once obtained can never be obtained again. This means that the former type of Metroidbrainia becomes the most pragmatic answer to the popular question, if you could wipe your memory and play one game again for the first time, which would it be? I've tried to avoid the use of terms like true Metroidbrainia versus hybrid Metroidbrainia because I feel that the Metroidbrainia genre is still so new that trying to break it down further into specific chunks would be detrimental to its growth. However, I appreciate that we're getting to a point where we can question if games like The Return of the Obra Dinn meet the criteria to be included. This is a difficult line to walk. By defining a genre too rigidly, we can end up gatekeeping or omitting that which should otherwise belong to it. By defining a genre too loosely, we weaken its ability to specify or categorize what makes the genre unique. To expertly segue out of both rabbit holes back to Metroidvanias, this line is surprisingly still being defined. To repeat the definition I quoted from the start, Metroidvanias are a subgenre of video games focused on guided non-linearity and utility-gated exploration. I'd say this is probably a perfect definition, but many people seem to attach extra details onto it, almost as if those details were self-evident. For example, what is not seen in this definition are the terms 2D, side-scrolling, platforming, nor backtracking, all of which many consider to being core to a Metroidvania, and all of which can be found in the game Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening also adheres to every aspect of the definition we've been detailing. It is a game focused on guided, non-linear, utility-gated exploration. But most people have an issue calling Link's Awakening a Metroidvania. Here are a few games most people have no issue calling a Metroidvania. Metroid Fusion, despite it being extremely linear. Metroid Prime, despite it not being a 2D platformer. Blasphemous, despite it not requiring any utility upgrades to beat the game. Guacamelee, despite the utility upgrades being used primarily in specific sectioned off areas or dungeons. Even Dark Souls is considered a Metroidvania by some, despite it not having any utility gates at all. Though I do enjoy the idea that the charred ring is sort of a bootleg Variasuit. That's kind of a neat idea. But Link's Awakening is not considered a Metroidvania. What is going on here? What sort of utility upgrade does Link's Awakening need to obtain to get past the gatekeeping of what a real Metroidvania is? And if the old Zelda games are Metroidvanias, are the new Zelda games Metroidbrainias? Does Pokemon qualify as a Metroidvania because of utility upgrade HMs like Cut, Surf, and Strength? What about the badges that act as keys to the Indigo Plateau, but also as methods of allowing you to control different levels of Pokemon? Does Guild Wars 2 qualify as a Metroidvania because you can obtain different mounts that allow you to access new areas and change up your mode of travel? I don't think so. I believe games can have utility gates and utility upgrades without automatically falling into the Metroidvania genre. But that's just my opinion. A game opinion. This is where I believe the word focus in the original definition really steps in and starts doing some heavy lifting despite being subjective. It does beg the question, how much of the game needs to be about utility-gated exploration, or how much other stuff can there be in a game before it's not the focus? This subjectivity makes it difficult, so we tend to build bridges to other foundations. From what I've seen, many people define Metroidvanias based on which games scratch their Metroidvania itch. Some even go so far to break the genre down even further to Castlevania-likes or Metroid-likes. Castlevania-likes being Metroids that typically focus on tight melee combat and being able to incrementally increase player stats or level up via EXP gained by killing monsters. Examples would be like Bloodstained or Last Faith. Metroid-likes being Metroidvanias that typically focus on power progression purely via specific item/upgrade pickups or power/utility spikes. Examples would be Ori and the Blind Forest and Axiom Verge. I say typically focus because even then there are still some outliers. Like, what about a game that has tight melee combat but focuses on power spikes via obtaining upgrades? Really, what do we do with Hollow Knight? While these subgenres might be useful to some, I feel they teeter dangerously close to giving credence to silly takes like, maybe the only real Metroidvania is Super Metroid, since it's a 2D Metroid game where you can use a whip to fight enemies. I would say that I have a pretty broad definition of what scratches that Metroidvania itch for me. When first playing the original Dead Space, it did remind me a lot of Metroid Prime with its 3D map and potential for backtracking and perhaps the shared influence from Alien. That and the original Dark Souls still feels like the most accurate version of a 3D Castlevania game I can envision, despite multiple actual 3D Castlevanias existing. But games like Dead Space and Dark Souls, in my opinion, are not Metroidvanias due to their lack of utility upgrades, even though they have aspects of guided nonlinearity. It's a similar case for games like Kirby's Dream Land 2 and Dragon Quest XI, because while they do have utility power-ups, they don't have any permanent utility upgrades. But on the other hand, games like Jet Force Gemini, Pokemon Red, Guild Wars 2 all include multiple utility upgrades, but they don't have a focus on guided nonlinear exploration, so I wouldn't consider them Metroidvanias either. However, games such as Batman Arkham Asylum, Control, and Zelda Link's Awakening, they all fit into what I consider to be a Metroidvania because, to my understanding, they are all games that focus on guided nonlinearity and utility-gated exploration. And more importantly, they scratch my Metroidvania itch. Maybe we won't all agree on what games are and are not Metroidvanias, but I hope what I've detailed today helps improve the way we discuss the matter. In this video, we detailed the most common definition of Metroidvania. We learned about the lock and key system of utility gates and utility upgrades that works as its foundation. We talked about the ways that those utility upgrades can be used to foster guided nonlinear exploration. We took a peek down the rabbit hole of sequence breaking to follow the trail of knowledge gates and knowledge upgrades that are being used more and more frequently to form the burgeoning Metroidbrainia genre. And then we listed some areas where the definition we used at the start might have some gaps in what we can do about them. This video has been my most complex and in-depth one yet. I'm sure I've missed some important pieces you were looking forward to me detailing, or maybe I've even gotten a few things wrong, which is a tough pill to swallow because I'm addressing some spicy aspects of a genre many, once again myself included, are passionate and opinionated about. I've attempted to shine a light on aspects that I don't believe are talked about enough in a genre that is constantly morphing and evolving while also often evading an agreed upon definition. Please feel free to provide constructive criticism and corrections in the comments. I hope I've been able to positively contribute to the discussion on a genre I truly love. Thanks for watching, everybody.